Welcome to this lesson about evaluating supply-side policies. In this lesson, we're going to start with a reminder of some of the issues covered in the lesson called Introducing Supply-Side Policies, and then we'll go on to look at the key terms and to the evaluation of the effectiveness of different supply-side policies. Later on in this lesson, we'll focus in on the evaluation of policies designed to improve equality and fairness, and then we'll end by looking at their fiscal impact and some detail on the classic point that supply-side policies involve time lags for implementation. So to start with, can you complete the meanings of each of these key terms? Pause the video for a moment, see if you can write those in, and then restart when you're ready. Okay, I'm going to bring up those key terms meanings for you now. Here's the first one, actual growth, increase in real GDP, and this one is usually caused by an increase in AD. Different from potential growth, which is the economy's productive potential, not the actual real GDP at the time, and that tends to be caused by the upward shift of the PPF or the LRAS curve. And then the negative output gap is the difference between actual GDP and potential GDP, where actual GDP is below the potential, so you've got unemployed factors of production. And finally, full employment, when all factors of production are being fully and efficiently used. Good, so on to the next slide. So here we've got for you a reminder of why supply-side policies are so important, because of the various things that they do for the benefit of the economy, improving the supply side of the economy, increasing long-run aggregate supply, increasing our productive potential, increasing the quality or quantity of an economy's factors of production, and improving efficiency and productivity. So how do they achieve all of those good things? Well, again, a reminder from the previous lesson, Introducing Supply-Side Policies, they can achieve all the following macroeconomic objectives: steady growth, low unemployment with more output and more jobs, low inflation because AD doesn't cause inflationary pressure, you've got more price competitive goods because of a balance of payments. You're protecting the environment by investing in green infrastructure, equality is improved, better opportunities, higher income for people, and finally a balanced budget for the government, leading to more tax revenue. All of the things that you want from your dream economy. So it's easy to see why supply-side policies are sometimes called the holy grail of economics. But unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way. So now we're going to be looking at what might prevent these good outcomes and why these macroeconomic objectives might not be achieved. Okay, on your worksheet or on a blank piece of paper, what I'd like you to do, please, is practice drawing some ADAS diagrams. And there are two described here that you should draw. One with that large negative output gap, which was one of the key terms that we looked at, and one with the economy operating at full employment. When you finish them, adapt each of them, change them to show the impact of a supply-side policy for each scenario, and think about what you notice. You can pause the video while you're working on drawing those two diagrams, and then restart it when you've finished and you're ready to carry on. Now let's take a look at these two diagrams. We'll start with the one with the large negative output gap. And on this diagram, that's shown as the difference between the actual level of GDP growth at Y, where AD is crossing the initial aggregate supply curve, and the large negative output gap is the difference between Y and YFE, which would be the level of GDP that could be achieved if all resources were being fully used in the economy. And then we shift the aggregate supply curve out to AS1. And as a result, we can see that there is an improvement in the potential growth in the economy. We could be producing at YFE1 if we were using all of those resources. But because aggregate demand is at a low level and hasn't shifted, we still have the same level of output. There's no change in real GDP and no actual short-run growth, which may also even worsen unemployment levels. Now let's take a look at what happens in the second diagram, where we start out with no output gap, but with employment and growth in the economy operating at YFE, at full employment levels. Now, in this case, an increase in supply side or an improvement in supply side policies enables us to increase AS by shifting it out to AS1. We've got a new potential level of output at YFE1, but more importantly here, what we see is that because the macroeconomic equilibrium point between AD and AS1 has shifted outwards, we have a higher level of real GDP. That means we've got actual growth in the economy and we're much closer to full employment, and we've also got a reduction in inflationary pressure. So what can we conclude from this about the effect of supply-side policies? It could be exactly the same supply-side policy that was being employed in both of these two examples. Well, what we can conclude is that the impact depends on the initial state of the economy. It depends on where you're starting from with your actual level of growth. Here's another reminder of the difference between free market and interventionist policies, how they might differ in their approaches to achieving the same outcome for different factors of production. And here we can also evaluate these two different approaches in order to evaluate the effect of supply-side policies. Next, we're going to look at how you could use a diagram to show the impact of an interventionist approach in an economy. You're going to start with a nice simple ADAS diagram. So I'd like you please either in your worksheet or on a sheet of paper to draw out that diagram. And then when you're ready, here's the question for you to think about. Why might an interventionist policy cause both aggregate demand and LRAS to increase? So in the previous diagrams, we were only increasing AS. What we're looking at here is how we can increase AD as well. Please will you pause the video, have a think about the answer to that question, and write out bullet points for why, the theory of why that might occur, and also add to your graph, change your graph to explain how that might happen, to work alongside your written description. And when you finish that and you're ready, you can restart the video. So here's the theory, here's what you might have written as your bullet points to explain how this interventionist policy might work. First of all, we have an increase in government spending, and as G is a component of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand will increase and the AD curve will shift out to the right. And then secondly, if that government spending is aimed at improving the quantity or the quality of factors of production, so something to improve land or labour or capital or enterprise, then the LRAS should rise and shift outwards as well. Here's what it looks like on the diagram. What we can see there is that rise in government spending causing AD to shift out to the right to AD1, but also that AS has also shifted out to the right, provided that the factors of production have improved too. So we've got a new equilibrium level of Y1, P1, much higher level of real GDP than we had before, but also in this case a slight rise in the price level to P1. But how do you know how far to shift both of those two diagrams? So in this case, we had a rise, a significant rise in both. And the extent of that change depends on how far you draw the shift outwards in the two diagrams. So something you can practice is playing around with these diagrams, sketching them out in different situations, and seeing the effect of changing the amount by which you shift each of those curves. For example, in this case, if you don't shift AD outwards as much, you might end up even with a lower price level than you started with. So the point here is to think about what kind of policies would cause a quick shift of AD first, how big would that shift be, and then whether it might cause a large or a small change in the aggregate supply curve as well. Some practice of this comes in the X exercise on the next slide. So this exercise gives you some thinking time to think through the issues we've covered in this section of the lesson. There are 5 supply side policies listed for you here in the boxes on the slide. And the instructions suggest that you categorise, first of all, categorise each of them as either a free market or an interventionist policy. And then take each of them in turn and work through what you think the impact of that policy will be on both aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. How much do you think it will shift each of those 2 curves on the diagram? Draw a diagram for each one, and then once you've worked out how much you want to shift both AD and LRAS, you can see what the impacts are on the macroeconomic objectives of GDP and employment and the price level. You might even want to think about some of the other macroeconomic objectives as well, like equality or the environment, to see if there's any other evaluation you can add in. When you've finished that, you might want to send them to your teacher to get some feedback on how you've done in analysing and then evaluating the effectiveness of those policies. So that brings us to the end of the first section of this lesson on evaluating supply side policies. When you're ready, you can go on to the second and third videos.